So I believe that consciousness is fundamental. And how does that relate to matter? Well, I think that matter is a phase of consciousness. Phase in the sense that chemists and physicists talk about water having phases. In one of them it's translucent and it flows, and in another it's hard, it's white, it's opaque, it can split your head open, and in another one it's in this room where I'm sitting and where you're sitting, there's tons of it in the air and we can't even see it. So it's no good saying to me, well, matter doesn't look like consciousness, because frankly those phases of water don't look like one another, but they behave differently. So consciousness is everywhere in the cosmos, I believe. So everything has, to some degree, in some nature, consciousness. It is never cut off from consciousness. But of course, what is extraordinary about life is that it has, billionfold, trillionfold, whatever you like, increased the responsiveness, the awareness, the ability to respond in the cosmos. And I think that responding is incredibly important at the center of this. I believe all the things that we think we know and experience, and that we do know and experience, come out of an encounter, a resonant encounter, in which the cosmos is thought of as a field of consciousness. That is in a kind of ever-evolving dance with what is coming into being, which is never completely known until it comes into being. So it is always slightly surprising. There was potential there, but we didn't know exactly how it was going to be cashed out into the universe. And when it's cashed out, it changes things again. So the universe is constantly in evolution. Everything is becoming. It is not being.
I would love to start off this conversation because I know you've paraphrased Einstein saying that the logical mind is a faithful servant, but the intuitive mind is a sacred gift that has been forgotten. So can you explain what is the problem of focusing too much on that faithful servant, and what opportunities are we missing out on by not tapping into that sacred gift of our intuition?
Yes. Good question. I suppose I might just begin by making a distinction between what I call reason and reasonableness and mere rationalization following of rules that a computer could follow. So I think it's very important that we value our faculty of reason, but it's unreasonable to admit only reason. And indeed, Pascal said this. He said, it's a very important, he was, of course, a mathematician and a philosopher. And he said that and I agree with him entirely, that it is a very important faculty, reason, but it is very foolish not to see beyond it. So I think there's value in reason, there's value in science, there's value in intuition, and there's value in imagination. The first two of those, I think most people nowadays would accept without a blink, but I'm not sure about the other two. I think they've had a rather poor, shabby representation and treatment in the way we talk and in the education we offer. So, for example, imagination is not the same as mere fantasy. And those who are interested in English literature, who know the works of Wordsworth and Coleridge, they made the biggest distinctions and the most valid distinctions that I know in this area, that fantasy is something that takes you away from reality, but imagination is your only chance of getting into reality. That unless you actually are somehow open to an encounter with whatever it is, you see only a two-dimensional representation of this. Again, if I could go back to Wordsworth talking about his life, that when he was young, things were still able to be present to him, so that when he was in the presence of a waterfall, of a mountain, of a great ravine, he was there with it, and it was an encounter that was life changing. But that as he went on in life, the word, a ravine, good, a mountain, a waterfall, great, I know those, put them in my box of abstract things, and suddenly the real world was swapped for a kind of tinny paper representation of the actual world. And I think that's one of the things that we risk, is that we now mistake the map for the territory, and the left hemisphere offers a map. I mean, a map is not supposed to be comprehensive. if a map had all the information about all the houses on the route and all the people who lived in the houses and what they liked to eat and this kind of thing. I mean, that would be more information, but it would actually be a much worse map. So maps trade on being skeletally thin, and they only pick out a few structural points. But that is like having a skeleton and mistaking it for a living body. It's like trying to live in a computer screen rather than in and around the world that those screens reflect.
Beautiful. And what I hear is the difference between just, reading words on a book of what it means to experience human life and actually uh, living it through the experience of self, right? Knowing or gnosis, which translates very nicely to my next question, Iain, because I feel like what you've brought up is so important. We live in a world that not only acknowledges the left brain, but almost is built entirely by it. And you've referenced a couple of key points with our education system and science and the way we look and map life, right? So can you help the audience understand, because you've made this reference points before, and I think this is really critical, the difference between information, knowledge, understanding, and from understanding, I think you've mentioned wisdom. So can you help us understand that as a foundation?
Okay. Yes, sure. Well, information is just data points. They have in themselves no meaning because each of them, in order to mean something, depends on the existence of all the others, really. So in themselves, they don't bring any understanding. So you could learn all kinds of facts and factoids without actually developing any understanding of what you're talking about. So what one requires is not just information, but knowledge. And in the English language, there is just one word, to know. But in most other languages that I know, there is a distinction between different kinds of knowing. There is knowing the facts, so to speak, and there is knowing from experience. So, for example, take Paris. I know it is the capital of France. Excellent. You learn that in school. But I also know Paris because I was immersed in its life for a couple of years when I lived there. And therefore, I know it in the way that I know my best friend. It's not a data point. It's something that comes only through lived experience, through embodied, emotional, and I dare say spiritual experience. So those are two different kinds of things. But those in themselves don't offer understanding. I could have lived somewhere and had a lot of experiences and still not really understand it. To understand it, I have to put together a whole panoply of things that I do know and that relate to one another, because it's out of the network of relations that it comes. Indeed, for those who are interested in the ontology, what is there really? I argue that what there really is not things, but relations, and that the things emerge out of a web of relations. The relations come first, because without the relationships they stand in, they are not what they are. To say what something is, you've already got to say, well, the context in which it lives and out of which it comes and back into which it goes. So for us, for example, that is the natural world and it is the cosmos. These things are our home. They give rise to us and we give back to them, we hope. So for that, you need understanding. And what I like about the word understanding is that it puzzled me for a very long time. I was wondering, what is there that's beneath about all this? And it struck me because, in my first life, I was a literary scholar and linguist, that the medieval meaning of under still kept the meaning that unter in German has. So unter means underneath, but it also means among. So you can say unter Freunden, among friends. And the understanding is not standing crouching below something and looking up at it. It is standing among the various things that come to life for you in your experience. And out of that, developing what we call an understanding. In other words, a way of seeing how all this fits together and makes sense and has meaning. Because I believe that meaning, I should say this, I believe that meaning is not something we construct and add on. It's there for us either to discover or not. And incidentally, I think that the great values that make life mean something, those of, say, truth and goodness and beauty, are not things we make up. We may change our minds about what we choose to call true or call good or call beautiful, but the fact of the being truth, goodness, and beauty is not something that we can attribute to ourselves. I believe they are intrinsic in the cosmos, and we either fail to understand them, encounter them, bring forth, evoke something of them more into being in the cosmos, or we fail to do. We have that choice as a human being. And I think it's why we're here. We're here not to make stuff up, but to actually attend to what there is. And when we find it, to respond to it. And in responding, something grows. It is an entirely creative process.
Beautiful. And that really, I think that's so important because I think a lot of people confuse information for knowledge, information for understanding, right? Just on, just on a very superficial level of using these words on a day-to-day basis. So I appreciate you breaking that down for us. And, from that understanding, I know that you've spoken about wisdom as more of a spiritual experience of understanding. Can you share what wisdom relates into that context of relations and being amongst all these different terms?
Yes, I think when we get to wisdom, we're going into very rarefied territory. We're going into a world that has different qualities from the one we're used to. Why do I say that? Because obviously I can tell you how to get to know more facts. I can even tell you how to know more by experience. I can even sketch out how you would become enriched in your understanding. But what I can't do is tell you how to become wise, or even what it is. It is one of those things that can only be approached, as philosophers and theologians say, apophatically. In other words, by saying what it is not. It is not information, it is not knowledge, it is not understanding. You might be wise without having a lot of information. You could be someone who was intuitively aware of things that clever people might never see. So it's not about either being clever or not clever. It's a kind of way of approaching the world that comes out of the business of leading a fulfilling and good life. And that means an attentive life. So if you attend, my work, as you know, is very much, my neurological work is very much about differences of attention between the two brain hemispheres. What actually makes them different is that they have, for very good evolutionary reasons, which I could explain, they have developed to pay attention to the world in two entirely different ways. And it's not what they do like a machine, it's how they do it in terms of the attention that they afford. And when you change the attention, you change what it is you find there. So there is always a reciprocal, resonant relationship between us and the world. We have an idea, and then we have an experience that slightly changes our idea, and the idea goes back and approaches the world in a different way, evokes different things. So I'm not saying that we make it up. Importantly, it's not good enough to say, oh, it's just whatever you care to think. It is not. There is something that is truer than something else. Otherwise, there'd be no point in saying anything at all. or even being alive, actually, for that matter. But
Mm.
unless things have truth, then we're wasting our time talking and learning. But wisdom goes beyond that. And so, if you know, and I imagine that you do, the Zen tradition in Zen Buddhism, a lot of it is about shaking the provisional certainties that the one who is learning, the student, has. So just when you think you've grasped it, your Zen master will make you realize that you completely got it wrong. And that is not dispiriting. That is awakening, because then you think, I can't look at it like that. I need to see something else, which can be hinted at. And of course, it's hinted at very much in all the spiritual traditions, and it is in art, in poetry, in literature, in music, in the visual arts, and so forth. We get glimpses, we get hints, we get this feeling of something that is very important, that is trying to speak to us, and we feel that we want to respond to it. So wisdom comes out of this process. It can't usually come early in life because it requires being a bit shaken by life. There's a certain wisdom in the idea of being shaken, being broken, sort of reaching a point where you thought you were so very clever, and now you realize you hardly know anything. This is a common theme in most of the spiritual traditions. So, but it's not the same as ignorance. So the way I put it is, ignorance is what you have before you know, and wisdom is what you have after you know. So you may come to a point of unknowing, where all the things you thought you had, you have to let go of. But that doesn't leave you somehow back where you started. In fact, it is the putting forth onto the stream of life of your existence, your being, and your, understanding.
Mm. Yeah, that's very powerful from what you mentioned in the beginning, right? It's almost like the opposite, right? In order to define wisdom, we have to use what it is not
Yes,
to get there. And um,
indeed.
and the analogy I think of, and one of my mentors told me, is like enlightenment is like you're on a beach and you're getting to the horizon and you're at the edge of the sun. You're like, I made it. I made to the edge of the sun. I transversed the sea and I'm here. And when you get there, you're like, oh wow, there's another horizon and another horizon and another horizon. So
Yes,
I
yes,
find that as a beautiful
yes,
analogy to what you're saying, Ian, is
yes, yes,
it's the experience of going through the journey and realizing that what you have learned, you kind of have to detach from that journey, from that precise path of point A to point B to getting to where you're at. And I think this points very beautifully to spirituality, which is about the experience itself. And it, like you said, it is
yes,
a creative, generative process of knowing and unknowing amongst the whole, amongst this experience of this reality. And you've identified the differences between information, knowledge, and understanding. And I would love to kind of backtrack and dive deep to what you've mentioned on the science and also the spiritual aspects of the left and the right brain, because I think that really helps the audience, remember the forgotten gift, but acknowledge the faithful servant that we started this conversation
yes,
with.
yes. So where would you like me to go with that?
Yeah, can we first start on talking of the science or the distinctions between the left and the right brain and sort of the spiritual
Sure,
connotations to both? Yeah.
sure. Well, there was a lot of talk about hemisphere differences when I was a young person in the 60s and 70s. And it was an excitement caused by the fact that people had been performing some of the first callosotomy operations in which the two hemispheres are surgically separated, divided, for some people was a life-saving procedure. For people with intractable epilepsy, it stopped the epileptic discharges going across the entire brain, so they were able to maintain consciousness, and this was a great step forward. But it also gave psychologists the chance to interview one hemisphere at a time, if you like. And what came out of that was a rather simplistic idea that the left hemisphere was a little dull, but at least it was reliable and down to earth and rational. Whereas the right hemisphere was a bit of a flibbity gibbet. It sort of was excitable, emotional, creative, but not dependable. And this turns out to be almost entirely wrong. Partly we've just learned a hell of a lot more since those days, as you would imagine. And partly, I think, we have come to see, and this is the thrust of my particular work, was to, if you like, attend to attention as the key. And people had noticed that there was a difference in patients who had right and left hemisphere strokes, and that they attended to the world differently, but they hadn't really followed that through. And my work really does follow that path and see where it leads. And to answer the obvious first question, why? Why is the brain divided? Why is it asymmetrical? After all, if you just wanted more room, you could expand equally, symmetrically. And why is a lot of the traffic across the corpus callosum actually inhibitory? Perhaps even the majority. It does convey information, but it also conveys, leave me alone, I'm dealing with this. Now that suggests that these two hemispheres, they do obviously work cooperatively, but they also work in a way inhibiting one another, so that competition and cooperation come together in collaboration. And that, of course, is also the history of evolution in biology. I mean, we have this idea that it's all about competition, but it's equally about cooperation. In fact, species that are successful tend to have been those that learned how to cooperate. So, that having been said, what can we say about the differences? Well, the left hemisphere is paying a very particulate attention, just a very specially narrow attention to a detail. Why? Because evolutionarily, it is the one that helps us get lunch. And to get lunch, you have to be able to fixate something and very quickly go and get it ahead of the competition. Fine. For that, you just need this very precise, very beautifully focused attention to that detail that interests you. But the rest can go hang. But the trouble is that if the rest did, you wouldn't survive. You'd become somebody else's lunch while you were getting your own, and you need to look out for the predator while you're getting your own food, and you need to be looking out for your mate and for your offspring. And for that, you need a quite different kind of attention. In fact, the exact opposite. Very broad, open, sustained vigilance, not this micro-targeted from here to there. Let's get it. And so when you think about it, this gives rise to two kinds of experiential worlds. I know that for most of us, most of the time, these things are integrated. But each hemisphere actually subtends or yields, brings into being for us a quite different kind of world with different values. So the left hemisphere world, its value is power. It's manipulation, it's getting and grabbing, okay? And it sees a world that's made up of bits that it already knows what they are. It might have got it wrong, but it doesn't really matter, because it's better to go quickly for it, grab it and get it, than to go, not sure, is that really a rabbit, or is it something else? So it's not interested in all the fine stuff. It's just interested in grossly getting. So for it, the world is made up of bits that are useful, bits that are independent, have no meaning, are taken out of context, are abstract, and are blatant, if you like. They're very much the world that is explicit. It's explicitly what you see there. For the right hemisphere, however, it sees that nothing is fixed and certain, but that actually everything is always changing, and that it might be what you think it is, but it might, importantly, be something else. And remember, in science, as well as everywhere else in life, very often seeing that something isn't quite what you thought it was is a very important step. So the right hemisphere yields a different world, one that is flowing and changing and alive, in which context is everything. Context can completely change the meaning of something, can actually reverse the meaning of something. I give the amusing example of cereal packets in America. So there are four sizes. There's jumbo, which means very large. And then there's economy, which means large. And finally, there's family, which means medium. But at the end, there is large, which means small. So context changes everything. And what it sees is implicit. And that may sound not terribly exciting, but all the things that really matter to us and that make life worth living are much degraded when they're made explicit. What is love, actually? How do you describe it to someone who's never experienced it? What is friendship? What is sex? I mean, sex can be made explicit, but in doing so, it becomes something quite different when it's inhabited and is part of a bigger, wider context of a loving relationship. Religious truths and spiritual truths defy being put into everyday language. There's a reason that poems are in that strange kind of language, which actually it both has its cake and eats it. It is language, but it kind of at the same time pulls the carpet from under everyday language. It changes language. And it's in that moment in which you're slightly taken off balance and you see, oh, there's a connection. You see something new, something comes to life for you. Music is only relationships. You know, it's relationships that make the melody. It's relationships that make the harmony. It's relationships that make the ictus that we call rhythm in the music. All these things. So everything important for us, everything that gives meaning to life, including religion and narrative and metaphors and myths and stories, all these things are best implicit, and they are really only understood by the right hemisphere. When you have damage to the right hemisphere, all kinds of very strange and interesting things happen to the subject's world. They no longer understand all these things I'm talking about. And just to add a little, and before sort of signing off, as it were, the left hemisphere is always optimistic because it's always in control. It thinks. It gets very upset if it doesn't feel it's got total control. It never acknowledges there's anything wrong. So after a right hemisphere stroke and only the left hemisphere is giving you the world, you may have half your body paralyzed, but you may very likely, and most patients in this situation do, deny that there's anything wrong. And when you point out they can't move part of their body, they say, oh, it doesn't belong to me, doctor, that's yours, or it's that patient over there. So they find ways of saying, no, nothing wrong with me, I'm fine, everything's good, I'm in control. Whereas the right hemisphere is seeing rather usefully, yes, there's plenty here that is beautiful and glorious, but there's also, let me see the big picture. There are concerns. There are things that we need to be aware of. And actually a dose of a certain kind of pessimism actually is very survival orientated, whereas a kind of facile optimism really goes before a fatal collapse. So those are the sort of differences, and they provide a different sort of mode of thinking about the world. One is very flexible and alive, and I mean literally alive, so that when people have a right hemisphere stroke, they see people often as zombies, machines, mechanisms, and they see the living aspects of the world as purely mechanical. Whereas the right hemisphere on its own, if the left hemisphere is, say, damaged, it may attribute life to the sun that is giving life and moving across the heavens. So These are different kinds of worlds, and for different purposes, we need them both. But they're not of equal value. First of all, the right hemisphere sees a lot more. It attends better than the left. Its perception, interestingly, in all five sensory modalities is actually superior to that of the left. Also, its ability to form judgments is much better than that of the left. So the left hemisphere tends to become deluded very, very quickly. So that idea that it was boring but sensible and down to earth and reliable, complete nonsense. It's not reliable a bit. And in the matter of things, I look at about 25, 30 of the most strange and weird and fascinating neuropsychiatric syndromes in which people have strange delusions. And almost all of them, if not all of them, are commoner or only exist when the right hemisphere is impaired, not when the left hemisphere is impaired. So all of those things matter. And so the left hemisphere can play a part, but it can never play the ultimate part, like what is this really about? What does this really add up to? It's a kind of halfway house. And one way I make this, I hope, comprehensible is to talk about learning a piece of music. So when you hear a piece of music, you take it in as a whole, and you just think, that's wonderful. I want to learn how to play that. And when you try to learn to play it, you realize you have to take it apart and practice this bar over and over again because the fingering is difficult. And you theorize and you see, oh, I see, this is the point where we return to the tonic and that kind of thing. But when you go out and play that piece of music on stage, you must forget all of that. Otherwise, you do a completely appalling performance. So it's not that it wasn't useful. It was very useful, but only at an intermediate stage. And in a way, that is a metaphor for the relationship between these things. So the right hemisphere grounds them initially. The left hemisphere takes information from the right and plays with it and unfolds it, rather like a good computer would do. It can carry out rapid calculations. But then the computer doesn't really get it at the end of the day. It's just done something it was programmed to do. It then has to give that back to the left hemisphere, which truly sees what is going on here. And I feel that in the world we're in now, we so overvalue the left hemisphere that we allow things to go to the left hemisphere and then never take them back into the integrated world in which they alone have meaning. And I give the analogy that it's rather like somebody trying to understand a motorbike. Well, to understand a motorbike, you need to actually get on it. First of all, with somebody who knows how to ride it, and later you can ride it yourself. But you might just take it apart on the analysis. Very important. Let's take it apart. So you take all the bits apart on the garage floor, and you look at these pieces of metal, and you go, well, search me, I have no idea what this thing does. And we seem to be like that. We've taken the world apart and we go, well, none of it seems to have any meaning. Well, it's not surprising because the meaning only exists and persists in the context of the whole. And what you've just done is destroy the whole.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for such a beautiful and thorough explanation of that, Iain. And to go back to the jumbo-sized cereal in America, it's my, I can't tell if it's my implicit bias or some intuitive faculty, but once I get a month's worth of cereal in my pantry, you know, my left brain's like, oh, how am I gonna eat all this? But all that to say, you know, I love what you're saying because it really coming back to the points of what I've learned also in Buddhist tradition and in traditional Chinese medicine is this yin and yang, right? This masculine and feminine aspects of the left brain is more giving, and the right brain is more receiving information, energy, experiences, and to your point, another way to describe it for me is receptivity and conductivity, right? What does it mean to put out into the universe, and what does it mean to receive that experience too? And this is another question I have, right? Because we've sort of broken down the circuitry, the mechanism of the brain, but we haven't talked about what actually creates this experience, which leads to my question, where I know you've said in the past that consciousness is like trying to find urine coming out of the kidneys, right? But we don't even know where this urine comes from. So can you help us understand what is your take on consciousness itself in relation to what we've spoken about?
Wow. Well, there's a challenge. Yeah. Well, first I'll say what I can say concisely, cutting all the explanations out, but just giving the message. And then I'll say how that relates to the two hemispheres, if that's okay. So, to cut a long story short, I think there are only three possible ways in which we can relate the brain and consciousness. One is that the brain emits consciousness, another is that it transmits consciousness, like a radio set, and the third is that it permits consciousness. In other words, that consciousness is all around, but what it's actually doing is funneling it, molding it, channeling it in the way that one's larynx channels the flow of breath that comes through and makes it into all that is important, the special voice that is your voice, my voice, gives it the meaning. So I argue at some length that we have to accept that nobody has ever got near the slightest idea how you can get consciousness out of matter if matter, and that's a big if matter has nothing of consciousness about it. I happen to believe it does, so it's not a problem for me. But if you actually hold that consciousness has nothing to do, matter has nothing to do with consciousness, you really have a problem. And the permit idea seems to me to answer to what we actually know. So I believe that consciousness is fundamental. It's what philosophers call an ontological primitive. That is to say, you can't find something it emerges from. It isn't the consequence of anything else. It is, from the word go. And how does that relate to matter? Well, I think that matter is a phase of consciousness. And when I use the word phase, I don't mean a temporal phase. I mean a phase in the sense that chemists and physicists talk about water having phases. You know, in one of them it's translucent and it flows and all the rest. And in another it's hard, it's white, it's opaque, it can split your head open. And in another one it's in this room where I'm sitting and where you're sitting. There's tons of it in the air and we can't even see it. So it's no good saying to me, well, matter doesn't look like consciousness, because frankly, those phases of water don't look like one another, but they behave differently. And they behave differently in terms of their permanence and their resistance. And funnily enough, I believe that matter offers two things that we are perhaps not used to thinking of together. One is a degree of permanence for a while. In other words, my thoughts can go anywhere, and as soon as they're had, they're away. Whereas, you know, the table I'm sitting at, absent an accident, will be here tomorrow morning. So that's one thing. But the other is resistance. And we're not used to thinking of resistance as positive. We think of resistance as something that should be, as far as possible, got out of the way. But absolutely not. Resistance is what forms things. In fact, resistance is what forms a person, overcoming things, seeing their way around them. If they had nothing that gave any resistance at all, they would never become intelligent. They would never develop any imagination. They would just be like a great blob. So we need resistance. Everything that's creative requires resistance, and it requires a degree of persistence. And the one thing you can say about the cosmos for certain is that it appears to be creative. If we buy the story of the Big Bang, and there's no reason not to, it started very simply, and it has massively ramified ever since then. It has turned into phenomenally intricate, beautiful individuations which do nothing to spoil the overall integrity. So there is a balance all the time between what holds together and what differentiates. These go together. And the great German poet and philosopher Goethe said, dividing the united, uniting the divided is the whole work of nature. I haven't got time to go into that, but I just leave that there for the moment. So consciousness is everywhere in the cosmos, I believe. And it probably takes the form of fields, and these fields can become localized. In this, it is not different from the way physicists talk about whatever physical matter is, that it is probably fields that are often vastly extensive, and that it can at times be quantized into local phenomena. And it can be waves, and it can be particles, and so forth. So I think these distinctions are, I think in the end, we will see that they are applicable to both consciousness and matter. So I'm if you like, a panpsychist in this sense, that I believe that everything exists within a field of consciousness, and that consciousness of some kind will also be in whatever it is. So everything has, to some degree, in some nature, consciousness. It is never cut off from consciousness. But of course, what is extraordinary about life is that it has, billionfold, trillionfold, whatever you like, increased the responsiveness, the awareness, the ability to respond in the cosmos. And I think that responding is incredibly important at the center of this. I believe that everything comes about through a resonant encounter. I believe all the things that we think we know and experience, and that we do know and experience, I don't mean to suggest that we don't, come out of an encounter, a resonant encounter in which both parties take part, and both parties will be, however little, but they will be altered by the encounter. So our encounters matter, they create things, and what we encounter creates us. So we're in, if you like, we're in a kind of a dance. I put it this way figuratively, but I think that the ground of being, whatever it is that underwrites the conscious universe, the conscious cosmos, and indeed in Eastern traditions and many other traditions around the world, the cosmos is thought of as a field of consciousness. That ground of being is in a kind of ever-evolving dance with what is coming into being, which is never completely known until it comes into being. So it is always slightly surprising. There was potential there, but we didn't know exactly how it was going to be cashed out into the universe. And when it's cashed out, it changes things again. So the universe is constantly in evolution. Everything is becoming. It is not being.
Beautiful, beautiful. And yeah, that reminds me of a beautiful quote that I attribute or remind myself of what is God, source of the universe, where one of my meditation teachers says that, God or source is everywhere all the time, to the point that um, a blade of grass being blown by the wind will still be known and remembered and experienced by God. So,
Yes.
speaking of that panpsychist view,
Yes.
right, and
Yes.
to your view of these fields being conscious, I think there's some
Yes.
people like Federico Fajin saying these quantum fields are conscious itself, and that, like you're
Yes.
saying,
Yes.
flipping the Big Bang Theory on its head, that consciousness created reality, which created matter, and
Exactly.
to the point where
Exactly.
consciousness is exploring itself, experiencing self,
Exactly.
co-creating with itself.
Well, yeah, co-creating with us. So the
With
field
us,
of
yes.
consciousness that is the origin of being is in a dynamic relationship with its productions. There's this lovely thing that the great poet William Blake says: eternity is in love with the productions of time. I think that's so fantastic. And so I think exactly this is how I see it.
Yeah, and I would love and just another comment, because it relates to how you see the left and the right brain, and
Oh
seeing,
yes.
because we see, when I pick up a spoon and eat my jumbo-sized American cereal, right? I can see that, right? It's physical. But I'm also very I look into the research behind the non-local effects of consciousness. And there was this one study where they used transcranial magnetic stimulation on, I think, certain participants, inhibiting certain parts of their left brain. And it showed that it increased the probabilities of micro psychokinesis, or altering random number generators.
Exactly. In fact, I
And
cite that in my book. Yeah.
yes, yeah. So I think this plays very well to what you're saying, is that even though we're, through the left brain, right, we chop down trees, build a house, right, and put a roof over our heads. But there's
Important.
parts of
Yeah.
consciousness that are non-local, invisible, that are creating the potential energy, as I would say, the abstract form of what is to come. And being a
Yes.
practitioner in acupuncture too, we talk about this energy, and like you said,
Yes.
it's very curious, because in being an acupuncturist, not only do you put in the needle, but the mere intention is very important too. We call that yi, yi.
Yes.
So not
Yes.
only do you
Yes.
put the needle into the right point, but the intention and
Yes.
attention seems to
Yes.
drive this energy in a better way than without it.
Absolutely, and what a vivid image that is, that resonates with me across a whole slew of areas, of course. And I thought just worth mentioning, because of course I never really came on to the relevance of the two hemispheres to the nature of consciousness. But I think, first of all, the idea that I have of it is much more understandable by the right hemisphere than by the left, which is always saying, but, let me just take this back to tangible things that I can immediately, in other words, the Newtonian mechanical view, the left hemisphere likes. It doesn't particularly like things that transcend it, but bad news for the left hemisphere. Physics cannot go back to the Newtonian world. We know more than that, and we're beginning to know more than that in biology and psychology as well. And two findings with using a TMS, to transcranial magnetic stimulation, to either suppress or enhance the right or left frontal areas, actually. One of them is that what are called psi phenomena, like the ability to influence a random number generator, seem to be enhanced when the right hemisphere is stimulated, and are not enhanced when the left hemisphere is. But really fascinatingly is some research that shows that we are very creative when we can switch the left hemisphere off. And a number of so-called savants have reached their special skills after having an injury that damaged their left frontal, their left anterior cortex, but almost never after damage to the right. But here's the kicker for me. There's a problem called the 9-dot problem, which most people, unless they've already seen it and been taught the answer, cannot solve in kind of finite periods of time. But in an experiment, subjects had their left hemisphere suppressed and their right hemisphere enhanced. And amazingly enough, 40% of them were able to see the solution to the 9-dot problem. That is absolutely extraordinary. It's the tangible data that we need that shows beyond doubt that this kind of creative thinking does depend, and I have a mass of information about that it does depend very strongly on the right hemisphere. That's practically the only thing that people used to say about hemisphere differences that is actually correct, that the right hemisphere is more creative. It's not that the left hemisphere doesn't play a part at a certain point, rather like my thing about learning the piano piece. It plays a part, but actually the creative act comes from the right hemisphere.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I think I've heard that episode on the telepathy tapes, or them discussing the savant syndrome there, which is, again, I think that we speak to the current state of science shifting from a materialistic, physicalist, seems like foundation that has been developed for hundreds of years, to now this shift with quantum physics, and understanding how the observer, the observed, and the agent itself plays a role in you know, not even science experiments, but life as a whole and what it means to be conscious. And I know they've
Yes.
tried in China too, in Eastern cultures. They know that psychic abilities aren't woo woo or crazy. It's a thing. And speaking of cats being very intuitive and psychic as well.
Yes.
Um,
She's
and
been
and
longing
I,
to butt into the conversation.
I think, yeah, it came at the right time too. Um, my next question for you, Ian, is
Mm.
that I think that we're seeing this shift in science, and I think it's a shift that, especially for people on the more, again, spiritual side, Eastern philosophy, it's like it's obvious, right? But to the skeptical person, right, maybe to the moderate person, how do you kind of describe this shift for them? Because your work is very much balanced in the left and the right side, but also looking forward too into the future.
Yes. Well, thank you for saying that, because I mean, of course, I couldn't have written my book without a lot of incredibly left hemispheric work. Um, but also, I hope being able to put together a large amount of information from a number of different fields so that we can understand it as a whole. And I think that, I just to comment on the East versus West thing. In the hippie era, there was a sort of feeling that somehow the East was really the right hemisphere and that the West was the left. And to some extent, there is truth in that, but it's more like this: that the West is very, very overbalanced towards the left hemisphere, but the East is much more balanced between the two, or certainly used to be. Without any disrespect, I now fear that the East is becoming almost as left hemisphere dominated as the West. But there we go. As long as we can hang on to the ancient wisdoms, there it is. And I think what one has to see is that the way increasingly we're educated, which is like shoving stuff, information into people, and then checking that it's gone in by seeing if they can regurgitate it, is not an education. It's not even the beginnings of an education. An education needs to help you think so that you imaginatively understand what it is you're encountering. You see why people in the past saw the things they did in the way that they did. You learn from the vitality of their art, things that we could well do with now. You see things that are there. And so it's not that we need to abandon things that we have in the West and the East. It's to rediscover the importance of things that we have now lost. And all the move forward in civilization, those big leaps forward, took place when people looked back and saw that there was something there that they had lost. So, for example, the Renaissance literally means the rebirth, and it means the seeing of the things that the Greeks and the Romans understood, but that the Europeans of the age of the Renaissance had forgotten, and to bring them back. And what we need desperately quickly is to bring back kinds of information, kinds of wisdom that people in the past had. And if we don't do that, I'm afraid that we won't survive. I think we can survive. I think it's a very exciting time. I think as long as we understand very rapidly the shortcomings of a view of the world which is all about spreadsheets and data and AI and all these things, and get back into the things that none of these things capture at all, which is the extraordinary richness of a world that cannot be captured by figures, cannot be captured in words, but is absolutely real to those who experience it.
Yeah, yeah, and it's the wisdom that we speak about is the experience itself, and
Yes.
I find that that human condition, that human experience of life, and how we relate to one another, um, is so important because it balances this almost transhumanistic, charge with AI, as you've mentioned, in trying to, improve every, aspect of our life and make everything easier and have no resistance, right? Which is the
Yes.
opposite of what you said, is that resistance is what is needed, is part of life. It's part of the creative,
It's a
generative
wonderful part of
aspect of
life.
life. Yes,
Yes.
yes. Which leads me to my sort of final question. I know you've mentioned Viktor Frankl, and speaking
Mm.
of meaning, which is what one of the most uh, profound ways to understand meaning is, he emphasized meaning comes from love and connection, doing something that is worthwhile, but
Yes.
also facing suffering with dignity. And my
Yes.
question comes with resistance
Yes.
and facing suffering. How do you, as a person now that, with your experience, knowledge, understanding, and wisdom, how do you give guidance, advice for people for facing suffering with dignity, knowing that this resistance is a part of life?
Well, it's a profound question, and I'm not sure I can answer it briefly without risking sounding too ready to give an answer. So, suffering is everything from getting a bit hungry to seeing your children destroyed by bombs and so forth, and other experiences, even perhaps more shockingly terrible. So it's a mystery, but in a way, there is truth to the idea that what matters is not what happens to you, but how you take it up into your being, what your life and your being can do with it. And so, if I forget now who I was talking to, but I was talking to somebody, yeah, just a few days ago about, I'm a great admirer of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was a pastor who, because he sheltered Jews and opposed the Nazis, although he wasn't himself a Jew, was imprisoned, tortured, and finally hanged naked. And he had prayers, a morning prayer particularly, which I try to say every day. And it is beautiful and it is full of a kind of faith. But in a way, in the end, he was let down, is one way of looking at it. And in the same sense that you'd have to say, when Christ calls out, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? He was let down. But the fact that he led the life that he did and was persecuted and put to death in a horrific way as a common criminal made him the most powerful man, arguably, in the history of the world. So we don't know what is in what we experience. We don't know what is given to us. And there's a lovely Chinese story. Unless we've got time, I won't try and
Yes,
tell it.
please.
Oh, okay. Well, it's one that I found very helpful for my patients, actually. And it goes like this. So a man has a horse, and he's a fairly poor man, but his pride and joy and his living is his horse. And one day the horse wanders off and is lost. And everyone, his neighbors, come to him and say, "Oh, how very sad! What terrible luck!" And he says, "Well, good luck, bad luck, who knows?" And the next day, back off the hillside comes his horse with another horse that it has befriended. And now he has two horses. And his neighbors come to him and say, "Oh, you lucky man, you have these two horses. And how did that happen?" And he says, "Well, good luck, bad luck, who knows?" And the next day, his son gets on the new horse to tame it. and is thrown off and breaks his leg. And they all say, oh, what terrible luck. And he says, well, bad luck, good luck, who knows? And the day after, the imperial army sends its recruiters through every village, taking all the able-bodied young men away to war, and his son is spared. And they all say, how lucky you are. So the thing is that we don't know what things offer to us, and it's really not for us to judge. At a very simple level, going back to physics, what is friction? Friction is nothing more, nothing less than that which stops motion. But it is also, by the way, the thing that starts motion. So if there were no friction, I couldn't get up, stand, move, walk. None of us could. We rely on friction. So these things are, in a way, beyond our capacity to rationalize about. But what we can do is, to the best of our capacity, to be accepting and as dignified as we can be in the face of these things. And in doing so, we may create an everlasting impression we don't know, we may or we may not, that is picked up by others. Lots of people in my life taught me things that they may not have been aware they taught me. So people say to me, so you had this education and blah, 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 blah. So what did they teach you? And I said, well, of course I learned a lot of things in the classroom. But the people who really taught me most were people who, just by their way of being, showed me something that was interesting, amusing, beautiful, or inspiring, whatever it was. And I thought, I'd love to be more like that. And I think we go through life all the time following something that is calling to us and saying, I'd like to be more like that. And it's up to us what we choose to follow. So we can choose to follow the negative, the dark, the destructive, or we can choose to follow the good, the healing, the holy, whatever one likes to call it. And that is our choice. And I believe that is indeed the if you like, the explanation of why there is life, and particularly perhaps human life at all.
Yeah, beautiful. It's where the rubber meets the road, right? The friction. Without the road, there can be no motion to the car. So beautifully explained there, Iain. And thank you so much. I know it's like you've mentioned, choosing a calling, right? I think you've called yourself a optimistic pessimist, but I like to think of the opposite. I think that you've done such amazing work in the body of books that you have written, and I know you've said you've been just driven voraciously by some higher power, higher calling, and it helps ground us, at least for the rest of us, to understand these ideas in such a simple and very well divided way. But comes back to this whole that you've explained, which is meaning, right? Where does meaning come from, and how can we use this meaning to transform even the most horrible things that have happened and currently are happening, and to know that some of these experiences, although no one told you a lesson, right? It's like that right brain picking up that bigger message, and it's like, oh, that person taught me so much without even saying a word, right? And integrating that with your left brain
never
there.
know.
So
we never know.
You never know.
I'd just like to say, you slightly misrepresent me when you say, I think there was a higher power directing.
Oh, okay.
I mean, I often call it a demon, actually, but
yes,
in a morally neutral sense. I do think that we are in a wonderful line of D.H. Lawrence's. He says, as we live, we are transmitters of life. I think that's fabulous. And I think the concept is we are transmitters, which is the title of the poem from which that comes. And I think that is an insight into everything we do. We are transmitting something. And we can choose how and to how much we do that. And so that's why I call myself a hopeful pessimist, actually, not an optimistic pessimist. But I call myself a hopeful pessimist because things look bad, hence the pessimism. And it's quite useful to have a sharp eye for what's going wrong, because otherwise we can be too blasé. So there's that. But I'm also hopeful, and I think it's a duty to be hopeful. And I think it's also rational to be hopeful, because we just can't predict the future, and we don't know what human beings are capable of. And they're certainly sometimes capable of amazing things. So there we are.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful. And as a closing, Iain, if the audience would love to connect to you and find your books, where can they search for?
Sure. Well, I have a website, which is not a bad place to start, and it's just called Channel McGilchrist. So if you just Google it, it'll come up. And most of it is entirely free of access, so you can spend more time than you want or have there, or you can decide to become a member. In terms of my work, it spans from the very, very short to the very, very long. And there is a short book, which I think you can download for 99 cents or something like that to a mobile phone, which I think is called The Divided Brain, Why Are We So Unhappy? And so it only exists, at least at the moment, as an ebook. And it's a quick read, and it tells you quite a lot about my philosophy. And then I'm best known for a longer book, not desperately long, but it's about 500 and something pages, called The Master and His Emissary: The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World. And in the first half, there's a lot of philosophy and neuroscience. In the second half, I look at the history of the West from the Greeks, the Romans, the Renaissance forward to postmodernism, at the different shifts in civilization and the history of ideas, and look at them through the lens of left and right hemisphere, and when they survived and when they thrived and when they died. So that's the one that probably is if you want to get a bit gritty, then that's the one. But if you really want to know my latest thinking and my kind of last word, it's a long book called The Matter with Things, which is a pun on three levels. First of all, I think we all agree that there's something that is the matter with things. Secondly, I think it's to do with our misunderstanding of matter. And thirdly, I think it's because we believe the world is made of things, whereas I believe it's made of relationships and processes. And that's subtitled, Our Brains, Our Delusions, and the Unmaking of the World, which is where I think we're at the moment. We need to wake up to our delusions. Yeah.
Beautiful, beautiful. Yeah, and I know that's a epic. It's over 1,500 pages, as I think I recall, around there.
It is, but if it's any consolation, the last 200 pages are bibliography and index. So
okay, all right, just to make that reference point. Thank you. So I will definitely leave those links to our audience down below.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I've gone very dark. I realize.
It's okay. I think it's
around late afternoon here. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, it's gone 5. I'm in the far north, and things are fading. Yeah.
Yeah, no problem at all. Well, I've deeply enjoyed our conversation, Iain. Thank you so much for sharing
Me too.
your wisdom, and I think it's such a important conversation to have, as you have reference to the titles of your books and the contents of within it, and it's more important than ever than now. And I'm just so deeply honored to share the space and to hold the space and to transmit this wonderful information to the audience and hopefully inspire, right, the current generation, younger generation, generations of all types to see that of what you're saying, that it's not about the matter of things, but the relationships, right, the interconnection, the experience that we have been missing, and it gives so much more meaning to life. So thank you so much, Iain.
Thank you, Jason.